Welcome, travellers. Tonight, I'm your trusty time-travelling guide as we slip beyond the velvet rope and into the wonderfully awkward, slightly scandalous, and thoroughly fascinating world of medieval intimacy. Now, before you get too comfortable on your 21st century sofa, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these wild historical detours. And hey, drop a comment letting me know your current time zone and what mysterious snack you're munching on. I love seeing who's joining this merry band from across the globe. So lights down, maybe cue up a gentle breeze for ambience, and settle in. Our first stop, busting the biggest myth of all. Contrary to what you've seen in movies, medieval romance didn't unfold under shimmering candlelight with a lute serenade and silk sheets billowing in a noble's bedchamber. No, the real setting was usually a tiny, drafty, single-room cottage. Imagine two exhausted adults, a couple of wide-eyed children, one or two snoring elderly relatives, and inevitably, at least one goat and a chicken, neither of whom had ever heard of personal space. Privacy, as we picture it today, was basically a fantasy. Most peasants lived in homes where the kitchen, bedroom, and barn all shared the same ancient dirt floor, each corner contributing its own distinct aroma. If a couple wanted a moment alone, they had to be masters of timing, volume control, and the art of not waking anyone or anything up. Curtains? Forget it. Those were for the rich or the church. Beds? Often shared with children or in-laws, and if you were one of the rare upper-class folks, servants might be snoozing at the foot of your bed or standing rigidly in the corner, eyes averted but ears wide open. If you think that sounds uncomfortable, just wait. Noble households sometimes kept actual written records of who slept where, all for the sake of the law or religion. Trust me, those records were as excruciatingly awkward as you imagine. Now, let's talk travel. Inns were no better. Instead of cozy private rooms, you'd find a single, lumpy mattress shared with one or two complete strangers, boots, body odor and all. Want a little nighttime affection? First, check if the bed's already occupied. Second, check if your new bunkmate is wearing muddy boots. If you are a married couple both awake and had managed to wash at least your hands that day, congratulations, you could squeeze onto a straw-stuffed mattress and simply hope for the best. Unmarried, that meant triple the caution and a stealth mode worthy of modern ninjas. Small towns, thin walls, and gossip that spread faster than last winter's flu meant you had to be twice as discreet and 3 times as lucky. And for those behind monastery or convent walls, the rule on privacy was crystal clear: absolutely none. No distractions, no whispered sweet nothings, and definitely no midnight strolls through the cloister. Yet, even there, human nature kept things interesting, which might explain why some abbeys splurged on impressively tall garden walls. But if you really want to understand medieval private life, you need to meet the era's ultimate influencer, the church. The church didn't just have opinions on what went on behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind threadbare curtains. They had a full instruction manual. According to their teachings, the only legitimate reason for physical intimacy was to create more humans. No pleasure, no emotional bonding, no stress relief, just reproduction. Anything else, either a distraction or a sin, depending on the day. And this wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, monks, and confessors filled entire volumes with detailed do's and don'ts for the bedroom. Improvisation was not encouraged. Certain days were strictly off-limits: major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and in some regions, practically every day ending in Nisiu. Hoping for a romantic moment during Lent? Sorry, that's a no. Advent? Also no. Which left you, if you were very lucky, with maybe a Tuesday in early April. Even within marriage, the church kept the expectations high and the enthusiasm low. Couples were urged to approach each other with the restraint of 2 accountants in a library. A little affection? Fine. Too much affection? Prepare for a frown from heaven. Passionate displays were, in official eyes, barely a step above tax evasion. One 13th century manual suggested that married couples should be intimate without pleasure, without sin, and, just to keep things lively, without delay. A recipe for romance that's about as exciting as a cold bath in February. As for methods, missionary was the preferred option. Not only was it considered the most natural, but it also minimized the risk of offending God, the saints, or your local priest peeking through the curtains. Anything else, especially if you looked like you were enjoying yourself, was instantly suspicious. And that includes, tragically, enthusiasm. Confession was where things got even more personal. Priests were expected to ask very pointed questions about private behavior, in case anyone had strayed from the celestial rulebook. These weren't vague spiritual check-ins. No, sometimes the questions were so detailed you'd think the priest was writing a medieval version of a relationship advice column. Believe me, your average 14th century friar probably knew more about the townspeople's bedroom habits than their actual birthdays. Still, enforcement varied wildly. Some regions and some priests took these rules very seriously, while others looked the other way and let the villagers sort it out themselves. Particularly among peasants, the official rules were often met with cheerful nods and a healthy dose of ignoring, the medieval version of smile and do what you want anyway. If you thought syncing romantic schedules was tough in the modern world, imagine doing it with a church calendar, a priest's blessing, and a schedule so complicated it made tax season look simple. Planning a romantic evening in the Middle Ages required patience, luck, and the enthusiastic blessing of Saint Valentine, who, as it happens, remained single for his entire saintly career. The church's opinions weren't just gentle suggestions. We're talking about strict bans on intimacy during Sundays, which belonged to God, Fridays, which were for penance, and Wednesdays, which were apparently just suspicious. Add in the full 40 days of Lent, another 40 for Advent, every saint's feast day, holy day, fast day, and in some places even certain moon phases. The result? The medieval calendar turned romance into an Olympic-level obstacle course. The goal was to keep your soul focused on heaven, even when your earthbound body had other plans. There were even written lists, yes, actual lists of forbidden days. Some confession manuals blocked out nearly half the year as completely off-limits. If you just happened to feel extra affectionate on one of those forbidden days, well, congratulations, you earned an extra serving of spiritual guilt and a bonus trip to confession. There's a story of a 13th century bishop who scolded a married couple for being excessively affectionate, which, in his book, meant more than once a month. His advice? Channel all that energy into prayer. The couple, as you might expect, were less than delighted. Unsurprisingly, the upper classes felt these restrictions most acutely. They had chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors monitoring their every move. Meanwhile, peasants were more pragmatic, with their lives revolving around livestock, unpredictable weather, and trying not to freeze. They had precious little time to worry about whether today was the feast of Saint None or just another muddy Tuesday. To top it off, some folks believed that intimacy at the wrong time could lead to weak children, divine punishment, or minus worst of all, a town-wide reputation. If word got out that you'd broken the rules, you might face shame, endless gossip, or a pointed sermon delivered with way too much eye contact. So while the medieval world was packed with prohibitions and awkward confessions, the pursuit of connection persisted, quietly behind thin walls and shared beds, with a knowing wink and a healthy disregard for the calendar. And now, as we tiptoe away from the shadowy corners of medieval privacy and church influence, let's step into the next chapter, because if you thought the rules of intimacy were tricky, just wait until you see how medieval folks navigated courtship, marriage, and the bustling world of brothels. Romance in medieval Europe was less about falling in love and more about falling into a legally binding agreement. Step with me into medieval Europe, where romance is less about whispered sonnets under the stars and more about hammering out contracts over who gets the better pig. If you're picturing moonlit serenades and secret love notes, I'm afraid you've stumbled into the wrong century. Forget candlelit dinners. Try negotiating a marriage while your future in-laws haggle over whether your grandmother's tablecloth counts as part of the dowry. For most folks, marriage is a business deal first and a love story, well, maybe eventually if you're lucky. Daughters become bargaining chips to secure land, livestock, or the promise that old man Bartholomew next door won't poison your well again. A bride might bring a small bag of coins, a chest of linens, or a modest plot of rocky soil, and in return the groom's family might grudgingly pledge not to be absolute nightmares at family gatherings. Courtship, when it actually happens, is about as private as a town crier's lunch break. Young people rarely get a moment alone unless you count the 5 seconds between their mother's suspicious glances. If things get particularly scandalous, You might find yourself tailed not just by your parents, but by a battalion of aunts, uncles, and that neighbour who definitely has nothing better to do. Among the nobility, arranged marriages are the standard operating procedure. Kings and lords treat their children's marriages like chess pieces, moving them across the board to block rivals or snag a better inheritance. Love is something you hope might develop later, like a medieval emotional patch you unlock after completing the main quest. There's even a popular saying that sums up this attitude: better a well-stocked pantry with a sullen face than an empty cupboard with dimples. Pure poetry. Even for commoners, romance takes a back seat to practicalities. The ideal groom owns sturdy land, a decent plough, and perhaps an impressively large ox. Meanwhile, a bride is prized for her reputation, her ability to keep a home running, and her skill at sidestepping the kind of gossip that can torpedo a market day. Not exactly the stuff of epic ballads. But that doesn't mean love is entirely missing. It just tends to sneak in through the back door, showing up after the ink dries on the marriage contract. If genuine affection happens to blossom, it's considered a delightful if unexpected bonus. Think of it as the medieval version of downloadable content, not included in the standard marriage bundle. Of course, where there's a will, there's always a workaround. Secret flirtations, playful folk songs, and the occasional moonlit stroll to the village well become the forbidden side quests of medieval courtship. Just watch out. If you're caught kissing behind the barn, you might find yourself paying a fine or facing the medieval equivalent of a very stern talking to from your father, pitchfork in hand and disappointment radiating from every pore. Now let's tackle one of history's most persistent tall tales, the infamous chastity belt. You've seen them in cartoons, period dramas, and if you're truly unlucky, those gift shops that specialize in historically inaccurate souvenirs. The story goes that husbands locked up their wives in iron underwear before heading off to war, leaving them literally and morally padlocked until their glorious return. But there's one small problem. This is about as historically accurate as a dragon in a jousting tournament. There's no solid evidence that chastity belts were widely used during the Middle Ages. Most surviving examples turn out to be Renaissance or Victorian creations, dreamed up by later centuries obsessed with the idea of medieval repression, sort of like a historical game of telephone gone wildly off the rails. Many of these belts were made as practical jokes, cautionary exhibits, or collector's items, not as actual tools of marital security. Medieval manuscripts, which love to spill the beans about all sorts of awkward details, are suspiciously silent on the subject. No tailors advertised them, no blacksmiths listed them on their price boards, and no parish priest ever handed one out with a wink and a blessing at the altar. If you pause for a moment and imagine medieval hygiene, which, let's face it, was already a bit questionable, then add a rusty metal contraption that requires a blacksmith and a tetanus shot, you quickly realize why the chastity belt never took off. It would have caused more infections and complaints than it ever prevented secret rendezvous. So why does this myth persist? Chalk it up to a mix of later moral panics and the kind of satire that would make a Renaissance scholar snort into his goblet. Victorian collectors and Renaissance moralists adored the idea of a repressed, over-regulated medieval woman. Apparently nothing says virtue quite like a padlock where your underwear ought to be. In reality, ensuring fidelity relied on much older and more effective tools: community surveillance, religious guilt trips, shame, and the ever-watchful eye of your extended family. Noble women were chaperoned so closely they could barely sneeze without a witness, while peasant girls had whole villages acting like amateur detectives, ready to pounce on any hint of scandal. A single rumour could destroy a reputation, void a dowry, or result in an awkward confession that everyone would be discussing for months at the barley market. Here's a twist that would scandalise many modern descendants. Medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels, they regulated them, sometimes with the kind of bureaucratic enthusiasm usually reserved for turnip quotas. In many urban areas, brothels operated as legal, licensed businesses. Town councils issued official licenses, collected taxes, and even set aside special red-light districts, long before anyone had ever heard of electricity, let alone neon signage. Some cities employed brothel managers, known with a straight face as keepers of public women, a job title that would make even the most creative medieval resume writer break a sweat. The reasoning was as practical as it was cynical. Authorities believed that having a supervised outlet for men's desires would lower the risks of more disruptive crimes, adultery, assault, or, heaven forbid, unsanctioned dancing. Brothels were seen as a necessary evil, much like potholes or overcooked cabbage. The church, of course, thundered its official disapproval, but in reality, many clergy simply looked the other way. Some even owned the very buildings used for these establishments, collecting rent with one hand while shaking a finger with the other. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've just unlocked the secret achievement for understanding medieval religious politics. Life inside a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't always unrelenting misery either. Some women chose the profession, often out of economic necessity, widows, for example, or those without family support. Others, especially in bustling port towns, were coerced or trafficked, lured by promises as thin as a peasant's winter cloak. There were even instruction manuals on how to run a brothel efficiently, complete with tips about clean sheets, basic health checks and scheduled hours, proof that even in the Middle Ages, bureaucracy finds a way. Patrons came from every walk of life, knights, apprentices, merchants, and yes, even monks with vows that suggested they should be elsewhere. Entry fees ranged from a few coins to a clutch of eggs or a bundle of wool, depending on what you had on hand and how persuasive your bargaining skills were. Services were catalogued, prices were posted, and occasionally, someone tried to pay with a chicken and a sheepish grin. If you're picturing medieval Tinder, think again. It was more like a transaction at the world's most awkward farmer's market. So as we step from these candlelit halls and bustling red-light districts, keep in mind that medieval society's approach to intimacy and relationships was far from simple. It was a world ruled by pragmatic deals, creative workarounds, and plenty of myth-making, proof that, even in the most regulated of times, human ingenuity and desire find a way to slip through the cracks. Now, as we leave behind the contracts and the chaperones, it's time to dive into the world of medieval hygiene, birth control, and the ever-present obsession with virginity. Let's set the scene. Picture this. You're standing in a medieval cottage at twilight. Candlelight shivers on the walls, a chilly gust sneaks through the thatch above, and you're about to lean in for a romantic whisper. But as your beloved pulls off their woolen tunic, you're hit with a fragrance that could only be described as eau de survived the plague. Let's just say personal hygiene in medieval Europe was less obsession, more afterthought, sort of like flossing for most teenagers. Sure, cleanliness was somewhere on the to-do list, but it usually came after things like patching the leaky roof, dodging the next outbreak, or wrangling a pig out of the pantry. Bathing did happen, but not with anything close to modern frequency. Peasants might wash up once a month, give or take a mud puddle or an accidental tumble into the river. Soap, either a rare homemade concoction or a luxury item imported from faraway lands, doled out sparingly and jealously guarded. City folk had public bathhouses, but these were a mixed blessing, sometimes banned outright during epidemics or moral panics, sometimes the scene of the local scandal du jour. If you were rich, things improved. You could summon up a steaming bath, have perfumed herbs scattered across the water, and get scrubbed down by attendants with the kind of dedication normally reserved for polishing silver. For everyone else, bathing meant a cold bucket, a threadbare cloth, and the faint hope that the horse stables masked your own unique scent. Water itself was a bit controversial. Some medieval thinkers believed that too much washing, especially with cold water, could open you up to illness or sap your strength. Others simply didn't have the resources. Why waste precious water on a bath when you needed it for drinking or cooking, especially if the geese were already eyeing the bucket like it was prime real estate? Now imagine trying to impress a sweetheart under these circumstances. Perfume was reserved for the upper crust, and deodorant was as real as a dragon's hoard. Dental care? At best, you might rub your teeth with ashes, chew on some mint if you were feeling extra fancy, or just hope your breath was less alarming than your neighbour's. Kissing was an act of courage, and occasionally a test of true love's resilience. Medieval clothing did not do you any favours. Layers of wool, coarse linen, battered leather and thick fur created a kind of wearable greenhouse, locking in heat, sweat and every aroma you picked up along the way, from the stew pot to the chamber pot. Yet, people still found ways to flirt, fall in love and get close. Maybe the definition of romance was different, or maybe, just maybe, when everyone smelled equally questionable, love really was both blind and nose-blind. Now, let's steer our time-traveling cart toward the question of family planning. In medieval Europe, controlling your household size was less a matter of strategy and more like trying to herd cats with a stick, possible in theory, but rarely successful in practice. And yet, people certainly made the effort. Don't let anyone tell you folks back then were clueless about cause and effect. They absolutely knew that certain activities led to babies, and many went to impressive, and sometimes downright bizarre, lengths to avoid an unexpected addition to the family tree. Some of the more rational approaches included herbal mixtures, animal bladders, and barrier methods that would make modern scientists wince. There were also rituals involving everything from burying objects near the doorstep to drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Yes, really, amulets, blessed by anyone with a reputation for piety or a flair for improvisation, were also popular. One memorable bit of advice suggested that vigorous jumping after intimacy could prevent pregnancy. If nothing else, it probably provided a communal laugh and a bit of exercise. There are records of linen soaked in odd concoctions being used as an early form of barrier. Some tried wax, and there are even scattered hints of what might be medieval prototypes of future latex devices, though the less said about the manufacturing process the better. The church, naturally, was not on board. Any attempt to avoid procreation was labelled as unnatural, sinful, or just plain rebellious. Marriage was for making babies, and anything that interfered with that mission was condemned from the pulpit with all the fire and brimstone of a medieval TED Talk. Still, people did what people always do. They found workarounds. Among married couples, especially those teetering on the edge of poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another hungry mouth was very real. Unmarried couples, on the other hand, had even more motivation to avoid the telltale signs of premarital coziness. Of course, reliability was, shall we say, not a medieval strong suit. Birth control in this era was a patchwork of folklore, local herbs, and a whole lot of optimism. When things didn't go as planned, which was often, there were two likely outcomes: a hasty marriage or a round of awkward explanations to the nearest authority figure. Despite what the official record might tell you, not every couple waited for the church bells before getting acquainted. In fact, premarital intimacy was common enough to spawn an entire industry of moral record-keeping. The church called it fornication. The village gossips called it getting ahead of yourself. Either way, there was always someone taking notes and someone else ready to point a finger. Towns and parishes maintained moral rolls, a sort of medieval shame spreadsheet, meticulously updated by officials who were, frankly, a little too interested in other people's business. If you were caught or even suspected of jumping the marital gun, you could expect a summons, a fine, and maybe a public lecture. Sometimes the money went to the church, sometimes the town, sometimes a lucky bystander who claimed to have witnessed your lapse. Medieval snitching, a time-honoured tradition. The size of your fine depended on how many times you'd been caught, whether there was a pregnancy, and if you eventually made things right with a wedding. Occasionally tying the knot after the fact wiped the slate clean, retroactive permission, medieval style. Other times you still paid up, but at a discount. Call it the early bird penalty, and then there were the social consequences. In a world where everyone knew everyone else's business, even if your priest was lenient, your neighbours probably weren't. Gossip moved faster than a runaway meat pie in the summer heat, and reputations could be shredded in a matter of days. Many premarital situations led to something called hand-fasting, a sort of informal engagement that, in some places, was legally binding enough for the couple to start living together. The church eventually tried to close this loophole, but not before plenty of babies arrived a little ahead of schedule. Among the peasantry, such matters were often handled with a mixture of practicality and resigned amusement. If a couple was serious and there was evidence in the form of a baby bump, a wedding usually followed, sometimes prompted by a gentle nudge or a firm parental ultimatum. Among the upper classes, however, the stakes were much higher. Virginity, for noble women, was not just a virtue, it was a legal clause, a political asset, and a source of endless anxiety. For peasants there was a bit more flexibility, expectations varied by region and circumstance, and while a young woman was supposed to arrive at marriage untested, a small fine or a hasty wedding could smooth over most transgressions. But for the elite, a single slip could unravel entire family fortunes. A broken engagement, or a pregnancy out of wedlock, could send shockwaves through generations of planning and alliance building. So, how did they check? Badly, for the most part. Sometimes it was all about reputation. She seemed virtuous, she avoided the stable boy, she had a trustworthy aunt. Other times, invasive inspections were performed by matrons or midwives searching for the infamous hymen, which, as science now confirms, is about as reliable as reading tea leaves when it comes to virginity. Still, the myth persisted. There were also post-wedding rituals, like displaying a blood-stained sheet for the wedding guests, a kind of medieval Yelp review of the bride's virtue. In some regions, if the sheet stayed clean, lawsuits and annulments could follow, turning a private night into a public spectacle worthy of its own miniseries. Men, meanwhile, got a free pass. Male virginity was considered a bonus feature, not a requirement. Nobody checked the groom's sheets, and at worst he might be told to steer clear of too many tavern maids. The scrutiny was almost entirely reserved for women. Virginity also carried heavy religious symbolism. Maidens were praised as pure vessels, a poetic idea in theory, but an uncomfortable reality for girls raised to believe their worth hinged on a single, unverifiable trait. Tales of saintly martyrdom were standard bedtime fare, and a failed virginity test could not only ruin a bride, but also tank her entire family's honour and property claims. So yes, in medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just about morality or romance. It was a kind of legal tender, traded, tested, and obsessed over, with consequences that could last a lifetime. And with that, our medieval tour of hygiene, birth control, and the tangled web of sex and virtue draws to a close, at least for now. But before you think the story ends here, let's turn our attention to something even more fascinating, the many forms of love, sexuality, marriage, and consent that shaped the lives of medieval Europeans. If you're wondering whether same-sex attraction existed in medieval times, the answer is a resounding yes. If you ever thought same-sex attraction was a modern invention, let me whisk you right back to medieval Europe, where love and longing didn't exactly wait for permission slips from the church. Human nature, it turns out, didn't suddenly get interesting in the age of disco. But acceptance? Well, that's where our time machine starts to sputter. Medieval society was a three-legged stool balanced on religious doctrine, social hierarchy, and property rights. And all three legs had something very particular to say about who you could love. To save you the suspense, the official answer was a man and a woman, preferably wearing matching last names, and with a healthy interest in producing more tax-paying villagers. The Church, never one to shy away from a bold statement, called same-sex intimacy a sin, grouping it with such infamous crimes as dancing on feast days or, heaven forbid, reading too many books. Depending on where and when you lived, the consequences ranged from a slap on the wrist and a few awkward prayers, to exile, or if you had enough land, being politely ignored. The pulpit thundered, but real life, as usual, was gloriously messy. We have poems, letters, and legal records that reveal people forming emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical bonds with those of the same sex. Some monks penned Latin letters to each other that would make even the most romantic troubadour raise an eyebrow. Noble women sometimes shared beds and swore lifelong devotion in terms that made their confessor reach for extra incense. Social structures like all-male monasteries and all-female convents blurred lines even further. Knightly brotherhoods tangled themselves in vows and affection that, depending on how you read the parchment, was either deeply spiritual, suspiciously poetic, or both. Historians still debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or just the only available social outlet for feelings that wouldn't fit anywhere else. Either way, there was plenty of longing, and probably more than one awkward confession at morning prayers. As for terminology, don't expect anyone to come out and declare their identity at the market square. The modern concept of sexual orientation simply didn't exist. You didn't come out, you crept carefully, often speaking in riddles or allegories, and if you were especially bold, maybe through a suspiciously intense pilgrimage taken in pairs. There were no rainbow banners, but there were songs, saint stories, and enough side-eye to fill a cathedral. Now, let's juggle another medieval favourite, adultery. Imagine trying to handle a live chicken while spinning plates and keeping your hat on straight. That's adultery in the Middle Ages, messy, risky, and almost guaranteed to end badly for someone. This wasn't just a matter of personal heartbreak. Marriage was a holy sacrament, yes, but it was also a business contract, a property exchange, and if you were lucky, a political alliance. So when someone strayed, they didn't just risk broken hearts, they threatened dowries, inheritance, and the ever-delicate balance of village gossip. For women, the stakes were especially high. A married woman caught in an affair might face public humiliation, lose her dowry, be forced into penance, or even sent packing, especially if she left behind a trail of evidence. Noble women who took a lover could find themselves locked away, divorced, or in the most discreet of circumstances, simply vanished from court life. Think less walk of shame, more strategic disappearing act. Men, on the other hand, found the rules a little looser. If a married man dallied with an unmarried woman, he might get some side-eye or a stern sermon, but unless the woman's family was powerful or the church was feeling pious, he usually avoided the worst punishments. Not everyone got off easy, though. Some towns got creative with penalties, public confession, steep fines, or, my personal favourite, paying for a new church bell. Divine justice, medieval style. Your affair rings out across the valley, literally. But the real threat was often domestic. Husbands, especially among the nobility, sometimes took matters and swords into their own hands. Honour killings weren't unheard of, and appropriate action depended almost entirely on the husband's status and sword collection. For the rich, scandals could spiral into family feuds sprawling over decades. For peasants, it was usually a matter of fines, maybe a goat, and a permanent seat at the centre of village gossip. So what about consent? Did the Middle Ages have a concept of it? Yes, but not the way we think of it today. Consent was knotted up in law codes, church doctrine, dowry negotiations, and a healthy dose of social pressure. Canon law technically required verbal consent from both bride and groom for a marriage to be valid, even if the only witnesses were a couple of sheep and a nervous priest. Romantic, yes. Legally confusing? Absolutely. But just because consent was recognized on parchment didn't mean it was respected in practice. For noble daughters, consent was often a formality tacked on after the ink dried on the marriage contract. Families negotiated unions like treaties. If the young lady's opinion was requested, it was usually after the dowry had spoken for her. Peasant women had slightly more wiggle room, but saying no could mean economic ruin or social backlash. Turning down the local reeve's son, that was a gamble you rarely won. And once inside marriage, consent became even hazier. Husbands had the legal right to their wives' bodies, and denying them could be grounds for complaint or annulment. Some church thinkers even wrote about the marital debt, which sounds like a joint checking account, but was actually far less voluntary. It was less enthusiastic yes and more retroactive permission, with church-approved loopholes that would make a modern lawyer weep into their briefcase. Still, it wasn't all grim. Medieval courts sometimes prosecuted cases of coercion or assault, especially when witnesses were involved or the accused wasn't well connected. In cities like London or Paris, records show both men and women bringing complaints, sometimes even winning. At the very least, they could make a public stink and give the local scribe something juicy to write about. In literature, consent was a topic full of drama. Courtly love poetry tiptoed around the subject, with knights pining, ladies refusing, and everyone fainting dramatically at the slightest hint of a yes. If nothing else, medieval writers knew it was important to ask, even if their heroes ignored the answer. The church's relationship with pleasure was, to put it mildly, complicated. Suspicious, even. This suspicion crept right into the bedroom, where ideally, nothing too enjoyable was happening. The church didn't ban marital relations outright. Someone had to keep the population going after all. But it did recommend moderation, extreme moderation. Think once a month, in the dark, with no smiling. Celibacy was praised as the gold standard. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows. Even married couples were encouraged to abstain, especially if they were older, holier, or just plain tired. Couples who voluntarily gave up intimacy were celebrated as halfway to sainthood, or at least halfway to separate beds. Some church thinkers, like St. Jerome, argued that even within marriage, desire was a weakness. Relations were for procreation, not fun, not bonding, and certainly not because someone looked especially attractive in their woolen nightshirt. These attitudes filtered down into confessionals and moral manuals. Priests were told to ask married parishioners if they'd been too lustful, even with their own spouses. Imagine the awkward silences at the altar rail when that question came up. Yet, for all these rules, people lived their lives. Most peasants, merchants, and nobles nodded politely at church teachings, then went home and did whatever felt right between chores, taxes, and the occasional peasant uprising. After a day spent threshing barley or haggling over land, a little affection probably felt more comforting than shameful. For the truly devout, celibate marriages were the model. Couples who lived together, prayed together, and considered carnal urges a thing best left to the younger, less holy villagers. Now, after all this talk of arranged marriages, fines for flirting, herbal remedies, and stern warnings about smiling too much, you're probably wondering, did medieval people actually fall in love? Absolutely. Awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite all the rules and risks, love always found a way to bloom in the cracks. Peasant couples courted in fields and marketplaces, swapping flowers and rumours over piles of turnips. Nobles wrote poetry and exchanged secret glances while pretending to care about the finer points of falconry. Monks and nuns wrote letters so full of longing that modern readers still argue, was it spiritual or something more? Medieval literature overflows with romance. Troubadours sang of distant ladies who inspired knights to get spectacularly injured in their honour. Courtly love stories glorified longing from afar, especially if you were pining for someone married to your boss. Sure, the love was usually unattainable, but that just made for better rhymes. Sometimes, people even married for love. We have records of peasants who eloped or flat-out refused their parents' chosen matches. Even nobles rebelled now and then, to the horror of their family accountants. The church, in a surprising twist, actually required spoken consent from both bride and groom, even if that consent was delivered through clenched teeth while clutching a goose as dowry collateral. And once married, many couples built strong partnerships, working side by side, raising children, surviving plagues, and navigating taxes, which is basically the medieval version of a romantic weekend getaway. Letters between spouses, especially during separations, reveal genuine affection, longing, and commitment. Widows and widowers sometimes remarried, not for politics but for companionship, choosing someone whose company they enjoyed, even if the days of jousting were behind them. Because after all the rules, all the sermons, all the awkward confessions, people still wanted to feel loved, hopefully before curfew, and ideally not during Lent. And as we leave the medieval dance of love, longing, and loopholes behind, keep your time-travelling boots on, because next we're heading to ancient Greece, where philosophy was about to be born from disaster. It all began with a disaster. Picture this. The Mediterranean sun blazes overhead, the salty wind stings your face, and the deck beneath you lurches as a storm rolls in. You're standing next to Zeno of Citium, a man whose entire fortune is bobbing on the waves, except, of course, he doesn't know he's about to become the world's first Stoic. One moment he's a wealthy merchant, his ships loaded with rare purple dye bound for Athens, and the next, the sea throws a tantrum worthy of a Greek tragedy. Waves crash, cargo vanishes, and Zeno's future dissolves somewhere between a lightning bolt and a particularly ill-timed gust of wind. If you've ever watched your investments go up in smoke, imagine that, but wetter and with a lot more existential dread. So there's Zeno, drenched, broke, standing on the Athenian shore with nothing but the rags on his back and the taste of salt in his mouth. His ships are gone, his status is gone, even his favourite pair of sandals is probably halfway to Crete by now. But here's where things get interesting. Instead of wallowing, Zeno does what any self-respecting time traveller, or in his case disaster survivor, would do. He wanders into the bustling agora, Athensans' aunt to the local shopping mall, his pockets emptier than a philosopher's promise, and ducks into a small, dusty bookshop. It's the kind of place that smells like old papyrus and desperation. He picks up a battered copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a collection of Socratic wisdom that's been passed around more times than a rumour at a Roman bath. As he thumbs through the pages, something clicks. The ideas inside are quiet, powerful, and oddly comforting, like finding a life raft made of words. Zeno, always a man of action, turns to the bookseller and asks, "Where can I find a man like Socrates?" The bookseller, in classic Greek fashion, points without a word to a figure hobbling past outside. That's Crates the cynic, philosopher, curmudgeon, and living proof that personal hygiene was a negotiable concept in ancient Athens. Now, let's pause here. Crates isn't your average philosopher. He's infamous for tossing his fortune into the sea, not out of heartbreak, but to make a philosophical point about detachment. Picture him as the original anti-influencer, living in poverty by choice, rejecting materialism with a theatrical flair that would make modern minimalists look like hoarders. Zeno, coming from the world of silk and silver, finds this a bit much. He's not quite ready to swap his merchant's robes for a beggar's cloak, but Crates plants a seed. Sometimes you need a little chaos to clear the ground for new growth. Zeno becomes Crates' student, learning the art of going without, the beauty of simplicity, and the fine art of not caring what people think when you show up to dinner barefoot. Still, Zeno doesn't stay a disciple forever. Over years of wandering, studying, and probably a few awkward confessions about missing luxury, he begins to weave together a new philosophy. He borrows Socratic ethics, injects a dose of cynic discipline, and layers on the logical sharpness of thinkers like Heraclitus. This isn't a cut-and-paste job. It's more like building a ship from the wreckage of another, one plank at a time. Eventually, Zeno finds his audience, not in a marble academy, but under the open sky at the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch. It's a public space, decorated with vibrant murals, where philosophers and passers-by mingle freely. There's no dress code, no secret handshake. Anyone can listen in, and so Stoicism is born right there, on a porch where the only barrier to entry is a willingness to listen. It's democratic, it's accessible, and it's a subtle nod to the fact that life's big lessons rarely wait for you to be comfortable. From the beginning, Stoicism is forged in fire, or more accurately, in seawater and setbacks. It's a philosophy for people who have seen the bottom and decided to build something better. Zeno starts teaching not just the art of surviving disaster, but the art of living well in a world that seems determined to test your patience. At the core of his teaching is the concept of logos. Now, before you picture a Greek god with a clipboard, let's clarify. Logos isn't just logic or speech. It's the rational principle that orders the universe. It's the cosmic Wi-Fi connecting everything, even if your connection always seems to drop at the worst moment. To Zeno and his followers, everything unfolds according to this rational structure. The universe isn't chaos, it only looks that way if you're not tuned in. If you learn to align your mind with this order, you gain peace, clarity, and moral resilience. It's not about being a robot, it's about accepting that the universe has its own plan, and you can either work with it or spend your days getting dragged behind like a dog tied to a runaway cart. Yes, that's their favourite analogy. Picture a scruffy mutt tied to a cart that's rolling down the street. The dog has two options: run with the cart or get dragged, paws flailing. Either way, the cart isn't stopping. Your choice is how much you want to bark about it. Zeno's early Stoics gather at the Stoa, debating and practicing self-mastery. They aren't trying to control the world, they're trying to control themselves. Fame, wealth, health, even the opinions of others, these are all indifferents. They're nice if you have them, but they don't define who you are. What matters is virtue, which in Greek is arete, not to be confused with a Mediterranean dip. Virtue is the only true good, the moral muscle that lets you stand tall no matter what life throws at you. Now, if you're picturing philosophical monks, think again. Zeno's students are lively, sometimes argumentative, and definitely not above a bit of porch gossip. Philosophy, in these days, is as much a social sport as it is a solitary pursuit. But one thing is clear: Stoicism isn't about retreating from the world. It's about standing firm in the middle of the chaos, unflappable, but never unfeeling. As time passes, Zeno's teachings evolve. Enter Clinthas, a man who brings a bit of muscle to the mix. Clinthas isn't your stereotypical philosopher. Before he ever picked up a scroll, he earned his bread as a boxer. Yes, a literal pugilist, fists up, sweat in his eyes, the whole 9 yards. By night he hauls water for a gardener, his hands rough and calloused. By day he sits among the philosophers, soaking up wisdom with the same dogged persistence he once used in the ring. Cleans is the living embodiment of Stoic endurance. He doesn't just talk about hardship, he lives it, day in and day out. His most enduring work, the famous hymn to Zeus, isn't just a paean to a deity. It's a poetic celebration of logos, the cosmic order that ties every moment, good, bad, or baffling, into a single tapestry. Cleanus hymn isn't religious flattery. It's a calm, steady assertion that everything, even suffering, has its place in a grand design. It's the kind of comfort that doesn't erase your pain, but gives it a seat at the table. But Cleanthus also adds a dash of emotion to the Stoic recipe. Unlike Zeno, who leans hard into logic and detachment, Cleanthus suggests there's room for the right kind of feelings: reverence for nature, admiration for wisdom, even a gentle affection for your fellow travellers on life's rocky road. He's not suggesting a return to wild indulgence. Far from it. He just believes that emotions, when guided by reason, can enrich rather than derail your journey. After all, what's the point of being virtuous if you never feel anything at all? Cleanthus isn't flashy. Some say he's slow of speech, hardly the kind of guy who'd go viral in today's soundbite culture. But his steadiness is his strength. He becomes the head of the Stoic school, not because he dazzles with rhetoric, but because he outlasts everyone else. His life is a walking demonstration that you can endure poverty, fend off bitterness, and stare down fate without blinking, or, at the very least, without losing your sense of humour. Thanks to Cleanthus, Stoicism picks up a bit of gravitas. His quiet resilience is contagious, and it gives the philosophy a sturdiness that's hard to shake. It's like philosophical armour. Nothing fancy, just the kind that keeps your worldview from buckling when life puts you in a headlock. But every movement needs its architect, and that brings us to Chrysippus. If Zeno is the founder and Cleanthink's the muscle, Chrysippus is the master builder who gives Stoicism its bones. Without him, Stoicism might have faded into a few charming porch stories. Instead, it becomes one of the most formidable intellectual systems of the ancient world. Thanks to a man so prolific, he reportedly wrote over 700 books. Sadly, most of them are now lost, probably used as impromptu napkins by some careless Roman. But their influence lingers. Chrysippus is relentless, methodical, and sharp as a freshly honed stylus. When he takes over the Stoic school from Cleanthus, he doesn't just inherit a philosophy, he re-engineers it. Where Zeno is reserved and Cleanthus poetic, Chrysippus is all about precision. His specialty is logic, and he attacks philosophical problems with the same vigour that Cleanthus once reserved for the boxing ring. In an era when most philosophers are still relying on flowery speeches, Chrysippus insists on airtight arguments. No loopholes, no fluff. If a belief can't withstand scrutiny, out it goes. He refines the Stoic distinction between what's up to us and what isn't. He expands their ethics, their metaphysics, and even their physics into a system so cohesive that later philosophers struggle to poke holes in it. For Chrysippus, virtue alone is sufficient for happiness. Not virtue plus a nice villa, not virtue plus a best friend who always remembers your birthday. Just virtue, plain and simple. It's a tough sell in any era, but Chrysippus doesn't flinch. One of his most intriguing contributions is the concept of the lekton, the meaning behind words, the unsaid layer that rides along with every statement. It's a bit like noticing the unspoken sarcasm in a medieval love letter. This idea deepens the Stoic commitment to logic and clarity. If you want to live well, you have to mean what you say and say what you mean. But don't mistake Chrysippus for a dried-up scroll in sandals. He's got a wit as quick as his logic. When someone accuses him of not living up to his own teachings, he shoots back, "Would you blame a doctor who gets sick?" He still knows how to treat illness. Stoicism, he insists, isn't about pretending to be perfect. It's about closing the gap between who you are and who you want to be, a little more each day. By the time Chrysippus is finished, Stoicism has evolved from a porchside pep talk into a formidable discipline. It's not just comfort for shipwrecked merchants or boxers with poetic streaks. It's a toolkit for cutting through confusion, chaos, and the daily grind. Whether you're a street vendor, a senator, or just someone hoping to get through a long Athenian afternoon without losing your cool, Stoicism offers a way to walk tall, no matter how rough the road gets. So, from shipwreck to painted porch, from bare-knuckle endurance to surgical logic, Stoicism is born, not in the halls of power, but in the open air, shaped by hardship and hammered into something lasting by three wildly different men. And soon, this philosophy, equal parts armour and anchor, will travel beyond Greece, finding new life among Roman generals, emperors, and, eventually, stressed-out moderns, scrolling through philosophy memes. By the time Stoicism drifted into Rome, the philosophy had already weathered centuries of refinement. But as it crossed the Mediterranean, it would find itself embraced by emperors, scorned by elites, and against all odds, revived by the very people it once sought to guide. Let's follow the journey as Stoicism trades the painted porch for the marble halls of Rome. By the time Stoicism strolled into the bustling heart of Rome, it had already spent centuries percolating among Greek philosophers and their sandal-clad students. But in Rome, this philosophy didn't just survive, it morphed, adapted, and in true Roman fashion, got dressed up for a far grander stage. The Romans weren't much for airy debates about metaphysics or the finer points of cosmic fire. They wanted something you could actually use, something you could clutch like a mental shield when the Senate turned against you, or the barbarians started knocking on the city gates. If the Greeks saw Stoicism as an intellectual exercise, the Romans saw it as essential armor for life on the edge. So picture yourself swept along the marble corridors of imperial Rome. The air is thick with intrigue, the scent of olive oil, and the subtle anxiety of people who know one wrong move can mean exile. Here, Stoicism becomes the ultimate toolkit for surviving not just philosophical quandaries, but surprise betrayals and, let's be honest, the occasional mass poisoning at dinner. The Romans craved a philosophy that could keep their hearts steady while the world spun out of control, and Stoicism, obsessed as it was with self-mastery and virtue, fit the bill perfectly. Enter Seneca the Younger, a man who embodied all the contradictions that make Roman history so riveting. Imagine him philosopher, playwright, and perhaps most perilously personal advisor to the notoriously mercurial Emperor Nero. Seneca was born into privilege, raised among the elite, and educated to the highest standards of the day. Yet, despite the wealth and the dangerously close proximity to power, his letters are laced with the uneasy awareness that everything could be lost in a single imperial whim. In his famous letters to Lucilius, Seneca is less a pompous sage and more a friend quietly warning you about the dangers of letting your emotions drive the chariot. He preaches restraint, mindfulness, and simplicity, urging his readers to avoid being slaves to desire or the whims of fortune. He warns, with the weary tone of a man who's seen the inside of too many gilded cages, that comfort can rot the soul faster than poverty ever could. But Seneca himself was no plaster saint. Here's where things get deliciously awkward. He wrote treatises on frugality while piling up enormous wealth. He advised virtue while serving a tyrant infamous for his vices. His life, as he readily admitted, was a patchwork of stoic aspirations and political compromises. "I am not a wise man," Seneca confessed, "but a lover of wisdom." He was painfully aware of his own failings, so much so that his advice to others often reads like a gentle self-scolding. Far from discrediting him, these contradictions make him feel startlingly modern. Seneca isn't telling you how to be perfect. He's showing you how to stumble forward, eyes open, hoping to do a little better next time. While Seneca handed Stoicism down from the marble pedestals of the elite, another Roman philosopher offered it to the masses. Epictetus, a man whose life could have been ripped from a grimy Roman soap opera. Once a slave, Epictetus endured poverty, physical disability, and the kind of social powerlessness that would flatten most people. But in the face of all that, he insisted that true freedom could only ever begin within the mind. "You may chain my leg," he famously declared, "but not even Zeus can conquer my mind." Epictetus didn't see hardship as a curse. He saw it as training. Every setback, every insult, every moment of pain became an opportunity to practice virtue. His lessons, painstakingly preserved by his student Arian, became a manual for inner liberation, a kind of ancient self-help book for anyone who'd ever felt powerless in a world of capricious masters and cruel fates. In Rome, Stoicism was no longer just another philosophical school. It had become a shield, a portable fortress you could carry into the chaos of daily life. And soon, that shield would be adopted by the most powerful man on earth, Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor, and the original poster child for wisdom under pressure. Now, let's take a quick detour and imagine the scene. Marcus Aurelius, draped in imperial purple, sits at the edge of his campaign tent somewhere on the freezing Danube frontier. Outside, The wind howls and the distant clash of swords echoes through the night. Inside, Marcus quietly scribbles in his journal, not speeches for the Senate or manifestos for conquest, but personal reminders to himself. Reminders that he too is just a man, battered by fate and struggling to stay upright. Being Emperor of Rome was not the spa holiday you might imagine. Plagues ravaged the empire, Germanic tribes pressed at the borders. Marcus's co-emperor and trusted ally, Lucius Verus, died suddenly. His generals, those supposed pillars of Roman order, turned traitor at the worst possible times. And then there was his son Commodus, whose hobbies included gladiator cosplay, and unfortunately, unlearning every stoic virtue his father tried to teach. But Marcus didn't wallow in self-pity. He didn't write for an audience, he wrote for survival. His meditations, never intended for publication, are a series of whispered reminders, sometimes weary, sometimes stern, always achingly human. In one entry he tells himself, "Begin each day by telling yourself, 'Today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness.'" This isn't pessimism, it's mental rehearsal, preparing for the worst so that life's surprises don't knock him flat. To Marcus, other people's betrayals weren't personal affronts, they were just expressions of ignorance. His job wasn't to control their actions, but to govern his own reactions. The only kingdom truly his was the kingdom of his mind. He reminded himself, often and with a kind of grim tenderness, that he could die tomorrow, so he should act today, not with panic, but with purpose. This was not despair. It was a kind of luminous clarity, a refusal to let the world's chaos poison his character. Despite the towering responsibilities of empire, Marcus Aurelius was obsessed with the inner world. He believed that no amount of external chaos could breach the fortress of a well-disciplined mind. While he rarely resorted to cruelty and never wallowed in excess, he also knew he'd never be a perfect Stoic. Who could be? In the end, Marcus returned to his philosophy, not as a badge of achievement, but as a compass in the middle of a storm. He didn't invent Stoicism, but he made it visible in a way no toga-draped philosopher ever had. He proved that Stoicism wasn't just for ivory tower theorists. It was for anyone. Yes, even the man with the fate of the world on his shoulders, struggling to carry a little peace into the battlefield of life. And then, as quickly as Stoicism had flourished in the halls of power, the flame began to gutter. After Marcus's death in 180 CE, Stoicism didn't vanish in a puff of incense. It faded, like the last notes of an old song. The philosophy that had once filled Rome's intellectual salons began to slip quietly into the shadows. The reasons were many, but let's start with the most glaring, Marcus's son, Commodus. If Marcus had been the embodiment of restraint and wisdom, Commodus was the living, breathing antithesis. He turned the imperial palace into a playground of excess, ruled by vanity and whimsy. Philosophy, especially one that preached self-control, had no place at his banquet table. Meanwhile, a new spiritual tide was rising, Christianity. As this faith spread through the empire, and eventually became the official religion, its rituals and worldview began to replace those of the old philosophical schools. Where Stoicism had taught self-reliance and acceptance of fate, Christianity emphasized grace and redemption. The two weren't always at odds, but Christian thinkers often regarded Stoicism as a noble pagan relic, admirable, but missing the final piece. Still, Stoicism didn't go quietly into that good night. It seeped into the cracks of early Christian thought. Many church fathers, from Augustine to Ambrose, admired the Stoics' moral seriousness. They might have flinched at Stoic pride, but they couldn't help but respect its discipline. Monastic traditions borrowed freely from Stoic practices: silence, simplicity, self-examination, and a healthy suspicion of luxury. You could find the echoes of Epictetus and Seneca in the dim, candlelit cells of medieval monasteries. Throughout the long, dusty centuries of the medieval period, Stoicism survived not as a roaring bonfire, but as a quiet ember. It was a philosophy whispered in the margins, kept alive by curious monks, scribes, and the odd scholar who stumbled across a tattered manuscript. Stoicism was no longer a public movement or something you'd shout about in the marketplace. It had become a secret code, a hidden current beneath the surface of Western thought. But sometimes, endurance is more powerful than triumph. Because when the intellectual climate shifted, when the Renaissance and the Enlightenment dawned and people began to dig through the ruins of the ancient world, Stoicism was still there, patiently waiting. Its seeds, buried deep in the soil of culture, were ready to sprout as soon as the world was hungry for clarity and moral purpose once more. And sprout they did. Stoic ideas found their way into unexpected places. You could spot them in the sermons of reformers, the treatises of philosophers, and even the quiet rules of monastic life. But no ancient philosopher could have predicted where Stoicism would end up next, in modern self-help books, leadership seminars, and yes, your favorite podcast. Stoicism's 21st century comeback didn't arrive with a scroll or a stony statue. It crept in through blogs, books, and 1,000 viral social media posts. In the 20th century, philosophers like Pierre Hadot began peeling back the layers of Stoicism, arguing that it wasn't just an abstract system but a way of life meant to be practiced, not simply debated. Hadot insisted that ancient philosophy was a spiritual exercise, not cold and unfeeling, but deeply healing. That message landed with a thud and then a roar. In the early 2000s, authors like Ryan Holiday dusted off Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, repackaging their teachings for a world obsessed with hacks and life optimization. Books like The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy turned Stoicism into a kind of practical playbook. Whether you were launching a tech startup, coaching a basketball team, or just trying to survive another Monday, Stoicism suddenly seemed like the answer. Tech entrepreneurs, productivity gurus, and even venture capitalists couldn't get enough. Tim Ferriss, Naval Ravikant, and their ilk began citing Stoic texts as if they were ancient instruction manuals for crushing your to-do list. The appeal was obvious. In a world addicted to speed and validation, Stoicism promised stillness. In a culture that rewarded outrage and impulsivity, it offered restraint and clarity. Even modern psychologists took note. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT for those on a first-name basis, borrowed liberally from Stoic principles. Challenge your thoughts. Focus on what you can control. Don't let emotion hijack your actions. Sound familiar? That's Marcus Aurelius, smuggled into your therapist's office in a slightly less intimidating package. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Critics began to grumble that modern Stoicism had been stripped of its complexity, reduced to motivational wallpaper for people who thought quoting Seneca would make them bulletproof. There's a kernel of truth in that. Not every Instagram quote captures the humility and rigor of ancient practice. Still, the fact remains. Stoicism didn't survive because it was fashionable. It survived because when life falls apart, when you lose your job, face illness, or wake up feeling lost, Stoicism offers a sturdy handrail. You can't control what happens, but you can control how you respond. That's a lifeline, not a slogan. And so we find ourselves in the present. Ancient wisdom, quietly steering modern minds through the digital storm. Today, Stoicism is a strange paradox, a philosophy built for silence and reflection, now trending in a world obsessed with noise. Scroll through your feed, and you'll see Marcus Aurelius wedged between cat memes and cryptocurrency tips. Open a bestseller list and you'll spot the Daily Stoic, promising to be your morning mental vitamin. 2,000 years ago, Stoicism was a porch philosophy. Now, it's practically a household brand. But Stoicism isn't thriving because it's the latest craze. It's thriving because it scratches a very modern itch. Mental clarity in a world that feels like a never-ending carnival of chaos. When everything is out of control, the economy, relationships, climate, even the algorithm, Stoicism hands you a map. It doesn't promise to fix the world. It promises to help you fix yourself. And the central questions haven't changed one bit. What is truly in your control? What kind of person will you be, no matter what comes your way? Unlike philosophies that urge you to retreat to a cave and ponder your navel, Stoicism invites you to dive into life. Go to work, raise your kids, deal with your neighbor's questionable taste in music. But do it from a place of calm strength, not frantic craving. Take action, yes, but let that action flow from grounded intention. In that sense, Stoicism is a quiet rebellion. Not the kind that waves a banner, but the kind that resists impulsiveness and emotional whiplash. The courage to pause before lashing out. The discipline to stay kind when the world feels cruel. The humility to remember you're not the center of the universe, but you are responsible for the direction you walk in. No wonder people are flocking back to it. Athletes use stoicism to manage pressure. Veterans lean on it to process trauma. CEOs use it to lead without ego. Teenagers, drowning in the relentless flood of digital comparison, turn to Epictetus for a little sanity. No philosophy is a magic spell. You'll still feel grief. You'll still mess up. You'll still have days where you want to throw your phone into the Tiber. But Stoicism gives you something rare, a way to get back up, reflect and try again. In the end, it isn't about being flawless. It's about inching forward. Quiet, steady, internal progress. And maybe in a world that seems to reward the loudest voice, the most revolutionary thing you can do is to cultivate a little stillness. Now, before you find yourself staring off into the middle distance, wondering if you've just had a philosophical epiphany or if you're simply overdue for a snack, let's switch scenes. Because if there's one thing the Romans loved as much as Stoic self-improvement, it was a good soak. And trust me, the Roman baths were less about quiet contemplation and more about the social event of the century. To a modern visitor, an ancient Roman bath might look like a luxury resort. Step with me, if you will, through the grand entrance of a Roman bathhouse. To your modern eyes, this scene might resemble a luxury spa plucked straight from a glossy travel magazine. Marble floors gleaming under the soft light, soaring vaulted ceilings stretching above, statues of gods and heroes peeking through the morning mist, and pools sending up gentle clouds of steam. But for the average Roman citizen, this wasn't a rare treat or a special occasion splurge. This was just a regular Tuesday. The baths were as much a fixture of daily life as your morning coffee run or doom scroll through social media, except with more nudity, communal sweat, and let's be honest, a much looser approach to privacy. By the time the Roman Empire hit its stride, bathhouses weren't some exclusive privilege reserved for the elite. There were more than 900 public baths scattered across the city of Rome alone, ranging from the architectural marvels of the imperial complexes to the humble neighborhood bath down the street. And every stratum of society made time to visit. Senators, shopkeepers, artisans, bakers, and the odd aspiring poet would all find their way to the baths, towels or tunics in hand, ready to dunk themselves into the city's social whirlpool. Cleanliness was certainly part of the equation. Romans liked to think of themselves as tidy folk, but the real draw was the rhythm of the experience, that reliable routine that made the world feel orderly and connected. The ritual itself unfolded in a carefully choreographed sequence. Imagine you walk in, greeted by the faint scent of olive oil, the gentle hum of conversation, and a temperature that hints at the warmth awaiting you. First stop, the apoditerium, or changing room. Here the social stratification of Rome was on full display. Wealthier bathers might be attended by slaves who helped them undress and guarded their belongings, while commoners made do with a wall hook and a wary glance over their shoulder. The room bustled with the sounds of sandals being slipped off, tunics folded, and the first bits of gossip already floating in the air. From there you drift into the tepidarium, a warm, inviting chamber that coaxed your pores open and signaled to your muscles that it was time to relax. The air here was thick and embracing, like slipping into a cozy blanket. Conversations grew louder, laughter echoed off the tiled walls, and you could feel the tension of the outside world start to melt away. The tepidarium was a gentle introduction, a soft launch before the main event. Next came the coldarium, the beating heart of the bathhouse experience. This was the hot room, and stepping inside felt like walking into the world's most ambitious sauna. The heat radiated up from beneath your feet, thanks to the ingenious hypercaust system, a Roman invention that would make even the most high-end modern spa jealous. Here bathers would sweat profusely, scrape their skin with curved metal strigils to remove oil and dirt, and sometimes indulge in a massage. The strigil, by the way, was the ancient world's answer to the loofah, a tool as effective as it was unglamorous. If you're picturing a room full of half-naked people scraping themselves while swapping rumours and occasionally sighing with pleasure or discomfort, you're not far off. Once you'd reached your personal limit for heat and humidity, the final stage awaited, the frigidarium. This was the temple of cool, a room dominated by a cold plunge pool that gleamed invitingly, and let's be honest, a little menacingly. The shock of the cold water was a jolt to the senses, a bracing reset that left bathers invigorated and perhaps a bit more awake than they'd bargained for. Romans believed this hot-to-cold contrast was the secret to good circulation, healthy digestion, and a balanced mood. And to be fair, there's a lot of modern science that would back them up. But beneath all the soapy lather and steam, the bathhouse was never just about hygiene. It was about belonging. The baths were where you went to see and be seen, to cement your place in the city's intricate web of relationships. In the tepidarium, you could strike up a conversation with a neighbour, a rival, or someone you'd only ever seen from across the forum. In the caldarium, you might trade business tips or listen in on a heated debate about the latest imperial edict. In the frigidarium, you could eavesdrop on the juiciest rumours delivered in low voices over chattering teeth. Some bathers brought their own musicians, turning the experience into a private concert. Others arrived with snacks and wine, ready to turn bathing into a social event that stretched into the afternoon. Poets would declaim verses to anyone who would listen, or at least pretend to. Philosophers, never ones to miss an opportunity for public discourse, would set up impromptu salons under domed ceilings, their voices bouncing off the marble and mingling with the laughter and gossip. The bathhouse was, in its own way, a democratic space, at least as democratic as Rome could manage. Status mattered, of course, but even emperors might share a room with commoners, if only for the sake of appearances. Slaves and women faced restrictions, with separate hours or designated spaces, but they were still woven into the fabric of this daily world. Bathing wasn't about vanity, it was about ritual, health, and the steady drumbeat of routine. The bathhouse dissolved individual differences, just a little, into that larger communal hum, the feeling of belonging to something greater, all wrapped up in a haze of steam and the faint echo of laughter. In that sense, the Roman bath was less about scrubbing away dirt and more about scrubbing away the isolation of daily life, one breath of steam at a time. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the true unsung heroes of the Roman world, the engineers. The bathhouses weren't just social marvels, they were feats of technological genius. Long before anyone dreamed up a heated towel rack or a self-cleaning showerhead, the Romans figured out how to transform bricks, water, and fire into the world's earliest wellness centres. The secret weapon was the hypercaust, a kind of ancient central heating system that would still impress a modern HVAC technician. Picture this: beneath the marble floors of the caldarium, a roaring furnace known as the prefurnium blazed day and night, tended by workers whose job description basically boiled down to, "Don't let the fire go out ever." The heat from this inferno flowed through a subfloor chamber supported by dozens of squat brick pillars, warming the floor above like a giant ancient radiator. Hot air then travelled up flues built into the walls, circulating warmth throughout the room with a consistency and gentleness that was nothing short of miraculous. The result? A cocoon of heat that enveloped bathers without filling the air with smoke or soot. It was so effective that even on the coldest Roman morning, you could walk barefoot across the bathhouse floors without so much as a shiver. The bathhouse architecture was equally strategic. Vaulted ceilings trapped heat where it was needed most, while domes softened and diffused the cacophony of voices. The progression from changing room to warm room to hot room and finally to the frigidarium wasn't just for show, it was a carefully designed system that regulated temperature, managed airflow, and ensured that every bather got the full spectrum of sensory experiences. Large windows, placed just so, harnessed the sunlight and flooded the rooms with a gentle glow. Water was always circulating, kept clean and heated to exacting standards that would make even the most obsessive modern health inspector nod in approval. And where did all this water come from, you ask? Enter the aqueducts, the silent stonework superheroes of the empire. These elevated channels snaked across the countryside, delivering a river's worth of fresh water into the heart of the city. Even bathhouses built far from natural springs could operate year-round, thanks to the relentless flow of aqueduct-fed water. The grandest complexes, like the baths of Caracalla or the baths of Diocletian, guzzled millions of litres a day, yet the system was so expertly constructed that waste was minimal and the supply never faltered. Water wasn't just for soaking either. Romans pioneered steam rooms, saunas, and even early versions of flushing toilets, all conveniently located within or near the bath complexes. Wastewater and sewage were whisked away through underground drainage systems, powered entirely by gravity. The baths weren't isolated marvels, they were intricately woven into the city's broader infrastructure, a testament to Roman genius and perhaps a stubborn refusal to ever settle for a cold bath. Keeping these marvels running was no small feat. The bathhouses required a small army of workers. The fornicators kept the furnaces stoked, cleaners scrubbed the pools and polished the marble, others hauled wood, replenished supplies, and patched up cracks in the tile or plumbing. It was a labour-intensive operation, but the payoff was obvious. Many of these buildings stood strong for centuries, weathering earthquakes, invasions, and the occasional rowdy toga party. So when you walk into a Roman bathhouse, you're not just entering a building, you're entering a living, breathing system powered by fire, water, and a stubborn streak of brilliance. There are no wires, no electricity, no digital controls, just a seamless experience of heat, comfort, and flow, all engineered by hand. It's enough to make even the most tech-obsessed among us pause in awe. But the baths weren't just about physical cleansing or engineering wizardry. They were information superhighways, Rome's answer to Twitter, Facebook, and the neighborhood grapevine, all rolled into one steamy package. In a world without smartphones, newspapers, or even a reliable postal system, the baths were where news broke and rumors spread. Gossip didn't just trickle here, it flowed in waves, washing over senators, merchants, soldiers, and poets alike. With togas off and guards down, conversations carried across the tepidarium in a kind of unfiltered, echoing chorus. If you wanted to know who was sharing whose bed, what new law the emperor was hatching, or which general had just made a mess of things in the provinces, the bathhouse was the place to listen. The Roman elite were well aware of this and used it to their advantage. Politics didn't end at the Senate steps. They steamed right into the bathhouse, soaking into the marble floors of the caldarium. A clever patrician might accidentally bump into a rival and float a proposal under the haze of steam. Patrons would meet clients to reaffirm loyalties, offer advice, or deliver a not-so-subtle threat, all while lounging in the pool. Even emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius made public appearances in the baths, burnishing their image as accessible and involved, even if they still kept a private wing for when they needed a little less democracy and a little more personal space. Business was transacted, poetry performed, philosophical debates staged. The acoustics of domed rooms could amplify a clever retort or a biting bit of satire for maximum effect. In a way, the bathhouse was Rome's version of Wall Street, the Senate floor, and a live podcast all at once. It was unfiltered, performative, and sometimes a little too revealing for comfort. Yet it was also where real relationships and real decisions began to take shape. When everyone is half naked, sweating, and slightly disarmed, the usual social masks slip just a bit. In the swirl of steam, the true currents of power and influence flowed, hidden from the formal glare of the forum. Health, too, was a central concern in the Roman bathhouse. This was where ancient wellness philosophy met the nitty-gritty of practical self-care. Doctors recommended baths for a range of ailments. Philosophers wrote essays about their virtues. Soldiers were encouraged to visit regularly to keep their bodies in fighting shape. The full ritual, hot water, cold plunges, sweating, scraping, and massage was all about restoring balance to the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If your humours were out of whack, a cycle through the baths could supposedly set things right again. Modern science would actually agree with a surprising amount of this. The heat of the caldarium opened pores, relaxed muscles, and got the blood moving. The cold plunge in the frigidarium soothed inflammation and delivered a bracing shot of endorphins. Strigils scraped away dirt and dead skin, leaving you cleaner than you'd ever be after a quick rinse at home. Afterward, many Romans enjoyed a thorough massage with scented oils, sometimes infused with herbs, sometimes just straight olive oil. Today we'd call it hydrotherapy or detoxing. To the Romans it was simply Wednesday. Large bath complexes even boasted small medical clinics where Greek-trained physicians examined patients, offered treatments, and dispensed advice. If you complained of a cough or aching joints, your doctor might prescribe not a pill, but a visit to the tepidarium or a tweak to your bathing regimen. Exercise was another piece of the puzzle. Attached to many bathhouses were palaestrae, open courtyards where Romans boxed, wrestled, fenced, or played ball games to work up a sweat, before entering the steam rooms. Health wasn't passive, It was something you earned, one push-up and one plunge at a time. Even mental health got its due. The slow, deliberate progression through the bathhouse, room to room, temperature to temperature, offered a kind of contemplative rhythm. Stoics and Epicureans alike wrote about the therapeutic effects of the baths, claiming they could clear the mind and soothe the heart. In many ways, the Roman baths anticipated our modern obsession with wellness, offering a one-stop shop for exercise, cleansing, socializing and healing. It was a holistic health center, just with more mosaics, fewer scented candles, and let's face it, a much higher chance of running into your political rival in a towel. To walk into a Roman bathhouse was to enter an aesthetic masterpiece. From the very first step into the apoditerium, you were surrounded by beauty. Walls were painted with vibrant frescoes, mythological scenes, idyllic landscapes, or the occasional cheeky caricature poking fun at bathhouse regulars. Marble benches lined the room, ready for your tunic or a weary body. On the best days, musicians played softly as you slipped out of your sandals and surrendered your worries to the gentle hum of the crowd. The tepidarium, often the most breathtaking room, was designed as a warm, welcoming antechamber to the extremes of hot and cold. Its high ceilings stretched above, sometimes coffered or domed, supported by columns of Egyptian granite or local stone. The floors shimmered with colourful mosaics, geometric patterns, floral designs, or scenes from daily life. Large windows bathed the room in afternoon light, making the air glow and the marble shine. The caldarium, with its heated pools and swirling steam, was adorned with bronze or terracotta braziers and the occasional gilded tap. The air shimmered, the floors radiated warmth, and statues of Apollo, Venus and Hercules presided over the proceedings, as if to remind everyone that even the gods enjoyed a good steam. Finally, the frigidarium offered a serene, almost sacred contrast. Its cool pool reflected a ceiling often painted with stars, geometric patterns or the occasional celestial scene. Skylights or circular oculi admitted shafts of sunlight that pierced the mist, illuminating the water in a way that felt almost otherworldly. Here, the chatter of the other rooms faded into a hushed reverence. The baths were intended to inspire awe, to remind every bather, rich or poor, powerful or nameless, that they were living at the very heart of an empire built on order, refinement, and no small amount of extravagance. Even the smallest neighbourhood baths took their aesthetics seriously. Mosaics might offer cheeky warnings in Latin like "beware of the dog" or "the bath is pleasant." Subtle reminders that even in the business of daily hygiene, the Romans couldn't resist a bit of wit. Every surface, every sound, every shaft of light was designed to charm the eye, calm the spirit, and make you feel, at least for a moment, like you'd stumbled into the very engine room of civilization, before you even got your hair wet. Yet, as grand as these spaces were, their story doesn't end here, because while the baths promised a kind of universal access, the reality was more complicated. Who truly got to enjoy these marvels, and how did this ritual spread, and eventually decline across the empire? Well, let's towel off and step into the next chapter, where we'll see just how democratic Roman baths really were. While Roman baths were public spaces in theory, not all Romans experienced them equally. Step with me now into the heart of a Roman bathhouse, the original social network, without Wi-Fi, but with plenty of hot water and awkward eye contact. On paper, these steamy sanctuaries were public, open to all, but the reality, well, just like the guest list at an exclusive nightclub, not everybody got the same experience. The bathhouse was a miniature empire in itself, where the lines of Rome's society shimmered in the steam, sometimes blurred, but never truly erased. Let's zoom in on class for a moment. Picture the grand thermae of Caracalla or Trajan, soaring domes, marble pillars, and a crowd that looked like the Senate collided with a bustling marketplace. Emperors might occasionally wade into the same pools as bakers or butchers. Sounds like equality, right? But don't be fooled. The wealthy entered in style, trailed by an entourage of slaves who juggled towels, oils, scented scrubs, and the all-important portable bench. If you were really loaded, maybe you had your own personal massager on standby, ready to unknot those shoulders after a long day of judging gladiator fights. The most opulent baths even had secretive little VIP corners reserved for the upper crust. Think of it as the Roman equivalent of a velvet-roped lounge. And even in the main pools, It wasn't a free-for-all. Sure, you might find yourself floating next to a senator, but let's just say striking up a conversation about the latest chariot race could earn you some serious side-eye. The social hierarchy was as rigid as a marble statue, even if everyone was equally naked. Now let's talk gender dynamics, because the Romans had more bathing rules than your average gym. Men and women usually bathed at different times or in separate wings. Hadrian, ever the moralist, enforced strict segregation, while the likes of Commodus and Elagabalus thought, why not shake things up? They permitted, and sometimes even encouraged, mixed bathing, scandalizing conservative senators and hand-wringing moralists who were convinced Rome would collapse in a puddle of immodesty. For women, access to the baths was a grab bag, a matter of city wealth, local custom, or the mood of whoever was in charge. In swankier cities, women enjoyed their own beautifully decorated bath complexes, with mosaics and columns that would make any modern spa jealous. In smaller towns, they might have to squeeze in their soak early in the morning before the men stampeded in. Some women relished the luxury, while others, especially those lower on the ladder, tiptoed around schedules, scrutiny, and whispers about their virtue. Slaves and freedmen, they formed the backbone of the bathhouse crowd. The doors were open, especially for those whose daily grind left them caked in sweat and dust. But don't imagine a fully egalitarian utopia. They were often relegated to off-peak hours or to more modest, less glamorous facilities. Even so, slaves were everywhere in the baths, scrubbing floors, working the hypercaust fires, massaging stiff muscles, and sometimes, if they were really good at their craft, gaining a bit of local fame. The most charming bath attendants could become minor celebrities. Imagine a Roman Yelp review, Caius the masseuse, 10/10 would recommend. What about outsiders? Rome loved to show off its baths to newcomers. Foreigners, non-citizens, and provincial folk were welcomed, especially during the empire's golden age. In fact, the bathhouse was a tool of soft power, a way of saying, welcome to Rome. Now take your clothes off and let's discuss the aqueducts. The moment you stripped down and entered the steam, you were participating in a ritual that transcended tribe, tongue, and hometown. The baths were a shared space. Sort of, just like in the Forum or the Senate. Your experience was always filtered through your social standing. But for a brief, misty moment, under the glow of heated marble and the slap of cold water, those boundaries could fade. That fleeting sense of unity, that was the real Roman magic. But let's not kid ourselves. The baths weren't just about scrubbing away yesterday's grime. These places were ancient entertainment megaplexes. Think of them as a gym, spa, library, sports arena, snack bar and comedy club all rolled into one. With the added bonus of public nudity, you could easily lose half a day, maybe more, without even noticing. Here's how a typical afternoon might unfold. You'd start in the palestra, an open-air courtyard echoing with the sounds of boxing gloves thwacking and the grunts of wrestling matches. If you fancied a game of ball trigon, the Roman answer to hacky sack, this was your place. After working up a sweat, you'd meander down a hallway lined with columns, past the statue of some glowering emperor, and slip into the library. Yes, you heard that right, a library. Roman bathhouses prided themselves on stimulating both body and mind, so it wasn't unusual to see someone toweling off with one hand and leafing through a scroll of Cicero or Virgil with the other. Who says you can't multitask? Music wound its way through the air, too. Picture a fluttist perched near a fountain, or a harpist plucking gentle melodies that bounced around the domed ceilings. Some bathhouses even hired comedians and acrobats, so you might catch a slapstick routine while being anointed with olive oil. If you wanted decadence, this was it. Feeling peckish? Just follow your nose to the snack stalls clustered near the entrance. The popinae, tiny counters run by quick-witted vendors, served up wine, bread, olives, cheese, and dried figs. If you were a big spender, your personal slave might fetch you treats from a nearby villa. Honey cakes, spiced sausages, maybe even a bowl of imported oysters. For the truly decadent, yes, you could lounge in the steam room, nibbling grapes like an emperor. Etiquette probably frowned on excessive snacking in the caldarium, but let's be honest, standards were as flexible as a Roman bathrobe, and where there's a crowd, there's always someone ready to make a wager. Gambling thrived in the bathhouse shadows. Dice clattered across marble tables, Bets were made on wrestling matches, or just on who could hold their breath the longest in the frigidarium. Was it legal? Officially, no, but the authorities usually looked the other way. After all, the bathhouse was where people went to unwind, let their hair down, and maybe lose a few sesterces on a hot streak of luck. Now, about those private corners and dimly lit alcoves. Some rooms doubled as lounges for intimate rendezvous, and yes, sometimes even as impromptu brothels. The Romans had a very different approach to public space, privacy, and sensuality than we do today. In the Caldarium's swirling mists, boundaries blurred, social, personal, and occasionally moral. If only these walls could talk, the stories would be worthy of a whole season of Roman reality TV. But let's zoom out and see the bigger picture. Rome didn't just conquer territory, it exported the Roman way of life, and nothing symbolized that better than the bathhouse. From the windswept hills of Britannia to the dry heat of North Africa, and from the pine forests of Gaul to the bustling cities of Syria, the Roman bath was everywhere. As soon as the legions set up shop, the engineers got to work, laying roads, building forts, and of course erecting bathhouses. These weren't just copy-paste jobs. Every provincial bathhouse adapted to the local scene. In chilly Britain or Germania, the hot rooms were dialed up to 11. In North Africa or the Levant, extra shade and cool pools offered relief from the sun. Cities like Timgad in Algeria, Jerash in Jordan, and Bath in England all boasted magnificent thermae, with mosaics and statues that doubled as imperial PR campaigns. Each polished marble slab, each steamy pool, whispered to locals, "This is Rome. Rome takes care of you." The baths were more than public works. They were tools of assimilation. For conquered peoples, the bathhouse was the entry ticket to Roman culture. Maybe you spoke a different language at home, but the moment you stepped into the steam, you were a participant in a distinctly Roman ritual. Bathhouses marked the true arrival of civilization. A city wasn't considered Roman until it had one. They often anchored civic centres alongside forums, amphitheatres and temples, mirroring the grandeur of the capital. That's not to say local flavour was lost. In Syria you'd find Eastern architectural flourishes, and sometimes, yes, mixed gender spaces, a shock to Roman traditionalists. In Britain, Celtic customs nudged the bathing sequence in new directions. In Egypt, bathhouses blended Hellenistic and Roman models, with lush courtyards scented by incense. But everywhere the Roman bath became a universal passport. Close your eyes in the Caldarium, and you could almost believe you were in the heart of Rome, no matter how many miles away you actually stood. But, as with all things Roman, the golden age of the bathhouse didn't last. The empire began to wobble in the 4th and 5th centuries, and so did its beloved baths. What was once a daily ritual for millions slowly unravelled. Why? Several reasons. First, the empire's wallet ran dry. Inflation soared, armies grew restless, politicians bickered, and the resources needed to keep those marble palaces humming, firewood, water, a small army of workers, became harder and harder to come by. The aqueducts, lifeblood of the baths, fell into neglect or were smashed by invading armies. Without water, even the grandest Caldarium became a cold, echoing shell. Religion played its part too. As Christianity swept across the empire, public bathing, especially the nude, mixed variety, suddenly seemed less like wholesome recreation and more like a pagan party. Church leaders frowned on the sensuous atmosphere, seeing the baths as dens of vanity and moral decay. Some Christian emperors tried to keep the public health side alive, but plenty shut the doors or converted bathhouses into churches, monasteries or government buildings. The steam faded, and so did the laughter. Yet the Roman bathhouse refused to vanish entirely. Its spirit morphed and survived. In the Islamic world, the hammam carried on many of the same traditions: heated rooms, steam rituals, communal cleansing, reshaped to fit new beliefs and customs, but unmistakably Roman at the core. In Europe, spas and mineral baths bubbled back into popularity during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, especially in places like Bath, England, and Baden-Baden, Germany. People flocked to these sites, seeking the same blend of health, sociability and indulgence that Rome had championed centuries before. Even now, the ruins of ancient bathhouses keep drawing us in. The crumbling arches of Caracalla, the time-stained stones of Pompeii's Stabian baths, the scattered mosaics across Europe and the Mediterranean. They're reminders that Rome's real genius wasn't just in conquest, but in comfort, engineering, and the art of shared ritual. The empire may have fallen, but you can catch a whiff of its spirit every time you step into a gym, a spa, or even your own bathroom. Next time you draw a hot bath, close your eyes, listen for the echo of distant voices, the splash of water, the hush of steam rising. You're a little bit Roman too, and so as the steam drifts away and the marble floors cool, we leave behind Rome's bustling bathhouses and turn our eyes to an even older civilization, one where medicine and ritual were knit together in the shadow of the pyramids. In ancient Egypt, medicine didn't live in a laboratory. Step with me now into the golden haze of ancient Egypt, where medicine didn't wear a white coat or lurk inside sterile clinics. Instead, healing flourished in the shadow of towering temples, echoed through bustling homes, and drifted in the incense-laden air of rituals. Here, the pursuit of health was a dance between earth and sky, science and spirit, and sometimes a good old-fashioned recitation to keep the nastier gods at bay. Picture yourself waiting for a healer. You're reclining on a woven mat, the distant call of ibis and the scent of myrrh drifting through open doorways. In comes your physician, a seronu, as they're known, armed with a basket of herbs, a keen gaze, and the readiness to call upon the gods if things get dicey. In Egypt, illness wasn't just a matter of germs or broken bones. It might be the result of a vengeful deity, a mischievous spirit, or some cosmic hiccup in Ayandat, the divine order that holds the universe together. So, if you stub your toe, don't just blame the furniture. Maybe reconsider your offerings to Kemet. Healers rarely worked in isolation. Imagine your appointment as a team sport. The physician mixes remedies and checks your pulse, while a priest hovers nearby, embroidering the air with incantations. These medical tag teams blended the practical with the mystical, wielding both salves and spells. The boundaries between medicine and religion blurred so thoroughly that the temple itself became the hospital. Temples dedicated to Imhotep, the legendary architect who upgraded to full-blown deity status, doubled as early clinics. These were places where you could sleep overnight in hopes of snagging a dream diagnosis from the gods. They called this technique incubation, and for many, it was the ancient equivalent of Googling your symptoms, only with more snakes and less existential dread. If you wanted to walk in the sandals of an Egyptian doctor, you'd need more than a steady hand. You'd hit the books, or rather scrolls, like the Ebers Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus. These ancient medical manuals didn't just spout mystical babble. They catalogued hundreds of remedies, surgical techniques, and case studies. Imagine unrolling page after page of advice ranging from how to suture a wound to which god you should bribe for stomach cramps. It's part School of Hard Knocks, part Hogwarts for healers. The Egyptians didn't treat spells as window dressing. If your leg was broken, you could expect a blend of honey and linen to patch you up, but you'd also get a recitation meant to shoo away any lurking spirits. Mental illness, that was likely a spiritual affliction, best handled with the help of a priest or magician. To modern minds, this might sound like a recipe for chaos, but to the Egyptians, it was the very definition of holistic care. You couldn't heal the body without soothing the mind, and you couldn't soothe the mind without a little help from the gods. Imagine being a healer in this world, a figure poised between realms, with one hand swirling a herbal poultice and the other raised in invocation. Long before syringes and stethoscopes, Egyptian physicians became experts at diagnosis, the old-fashioned way, by looking, listening, smelling, and prodding. They would study your posture, note the color of your skin, listen to your breathing, and brace yourself, examine your urine or stool. Yes, privacy was more of a modern luxury, and everyone just hoped for the best. Take the pulse, for instance. To the Egyptians, it was the speech of the heart, a vital sign that told the story of blocked or flowing channels, much like the Nile's irrigation canals. An irregular pulse hinted that something was amiss in this intricate system of air, blood, and spirit. Their anatomy wasn't always spot on, but their observations were sharp. If the symptoms didn't fit anything physical, the investigation turned supernatural. Was your illness the result of a curse? A spirit overstaying its welcome? Maybe the stars were out of alignment, or a sacred crocodile gave you the side eye, consultations often involved more than a physical checkup. The healer might call in a priest for a second opinion, interpret last night's dreams, or even check the movement of planets. The result was a diagnosis that could be as complex as decoding your horoscope after eating suspicious street food. Yet, these physicians weren't blindly guessing. They tracked patterns, observed outcomes, and built up a library of best practices. The Ebers Papyrus, for example, didn't just lump all illness into one mystical pot. It distinguished between wounds you could see and treat, and those that needed the intervention of higher powers. If it bled, you bandaged it. If it haunted you, you summoned help. When it came to remedies, ancient Egyptian medicine was like a cross between an organic farmer's market and a wizard's apothecary. Their shelves overflowed with honey, garlic, onions, juniper berries, and myrrh. Honey was a superstar, slathered on wounds for its healing powers. Garlic and onions weren't just for flavor, they tackled infections and inflammation. More adventurous treatments included crocodile dung and lizard blood for skin complaints, hippopotamus fat for mysterious maladies, and minus brace yourself, mummified human flesh for the truly desperate. While this might set off your inner germaphobe, the Egyptians believed the power of an ingredient came from both its physical traits and its spiritual punch. They didn't stop at plants and animals. Minerals like natron, a salty powder from desert lakes, dried wounds and preserved bodies. Copper found its way into ointments as a germ fighter. Oils pressed from lotus, castor beans or black cumin provided relief for aching muscles. Each prescription was tailored to the individual, often detailed right down to the mixing method, timing, and even a spell to be recited over the concoction. In Egypt, a cure wasn't complete without the right words, because, as they saw it, the magic activated the medicine. It's easy to poke fun at remedies involving animal dung, but many Egyptian treatments have stood the test of time. Honey, for instance, remains a staple in modern wound care. Their medical system was systematic, documented, and endlessly tinkered with. If one method flopped, it was adjusted and passed down with a note, sometimes with a warning, sometimes with a prayer. Their medicine chest drew from the land, the living and the divine, and they weren't afraid to reach into all three. But sometimes you needed more than a salve or a soothing chant. Surgery, though rare and daunting, was firmly within their grasp. The Edwin Smith Papyrus reads like the world's first trauma manual, listing 48 cases from skull cracks to broken spines. It's clinical, pragmatic, and refreshingly honest. Each case is sorted into 3 categories: treatable, needs further effort, and hopeless. In modern emergency rooms, this is what we call triage. The Egyptians were doing it thousands of years ago, long before anyone dreamed up a waiting room magazine. Their toolkit was no joke. Bronze knives, scalpels, forceps, hooks, and needles. They stitched wounds, drained abscesses, set broken bones with wooden splints, and even performed circumcisions. Some mummies show perfectly healed fractures, a testament to the surgeon's skill. Hygiene was front and center. Before sewing you up, a healer might wash the wound with honey, beer, or resin, each chosen for its power to keep infection at bay. Bandages soaked in herbal oils soothed swelling and sped recovery. For pain, opium or calming herbs were your best bet. Anesthesia as we know it didn't exist, so surgeries were likely swift, sharp, and punctuated by the patient's robust vocabulary. They showed remarkable restraint too. If an arrowhead was too deeply lodged, they'd leave it in place rather than risk further harm. It's the ancient version of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They didn't attempt internal surgeries or major amputations. Those were a bridge too far. But within their limits, Egyptian surgeons operated with expertise, documenting every success, failure, and hard-won lesson for the next generation. Now let's turn our gaze to women's health, a subject treated not as an afterthought, but as a cornerstone of Egyptian medicine. Fertility, pregnancy, childbirth, and contraception were all handled with a blend of reverence and resourcefulness. Women didn't just receive care, sometimes they gave it. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, dating back to 1800 BCE, is the oldest surviving text, dedicated entirely to women's reproductive health. It reads like the ancestor of every women's health manual, with entries on infertility, miscarriage, unusual discharge, and labor complications. Every case was laid out with meticulous structure. Symptom, examination, diagnosis and treatment. Sometimes medical, sometimes magical, often a bit of both. For pregnancy testing, the Egyptians got creative. One popular method involved a woman urinating on barley and emmer wheat seeds. If the barley sprouted, congratulations, it was a boy. If the emmer grew, a girl. If nothing happened, no pregnancy. It sounds like a plot twist in a gardening show, but modern science suggests there might be a speck of truth here. Hormonal changes can influence seed germination, so the test wasn't entirely hocus pocus. Contraception was another arena where Egyptian ingenuity shone. Recipes ranged from honey and acacia leaves to ground dates, all fashioned into a kind of natural barrier. Some formulas included crocodile dung, not exactly recommended by your local pharmacist, but chosen for its sticky texture and perhaps its magical symbolism. In a world without latex, you worked with what you had, and you hoped for the best. Childbirth itself was a communal affair. Midwives presided, guiding labouring women onto birth bricks, low platforms where squatting made delivery easier, the air filled with the sounds of encouragement and protective chants. Incantations were directed against the demoness Amit, feared as a bringer of miscarriages and complications. Amulets depicting Taweret, the hippo-headed goddess of childbirth, were worn for extra security, a kind of spiritual insurance policy. If labour stalled, treatments ranged from massaging the womb with castor oil to inhaling herbal fumes or sipping concoctions designed to coax the body along. Caesarean sections were unknown territory, so when things went wrong, hope and ritual were all that stood between mother and danger. Despite these limitations, Egyptian obstetrics was advanced and respectful. Fertility was sacred, womanhood celebrated, and childbirth surrounded by both practical care and spiritual guardianship. Every whisper, every measured dose, every amulet and prayer was part of a culture that saw life as a divine gift and a communal responsibility. So as we leave the flickering lamplight of Egypt's healing halls, their lessons echo on. Healing was never just a science, nor just a faith. It was a careful weaving of both, with every remedy and ritual a stitch in the fabric of life. And as we move forward, prepare to see how this blend of magic and medicine shaped not just bodies but beliefs, because in Egypt, a cure was never just about the flesh, but about the invisible as well. Next up, we'll delve even deeper into the world of magical medicine, mummification, and the enduring legacy that Egypt left behind. To modern minds, the blend of magic and medicine might seem contradictory, but in ancient Egypt, the two were inseparable. Step through the bustling streets of ancient Thebes with me. Yes, mind the donkey droppings, and you'll notice something a little unexpected in the air, the tantalizing scent of frankincense, the rhythmic chanting of priests, and, if you listen closely, the low murmur of a spell or two being cast. Here in Egypt, medicine and magic are not rivals. They're more like inseparable twins. Think peanut butter and jelly, but with a bit more holy fire and crocodile teeth thrown in. Healing isn't just about setting broken bones or mixing a paste for your mysterious rash. Oh no, it's about wrestling with invisible forces, soothing the soul, and when necessary, unleashing spells more dramatic than anything you'll find in a Hogwarts classroom. To an Egyptian physician, a fever might be the result of spoiled figs or an ill-timed swim in the Nile, but a lingering pain in your side, that could be the handiwork of a spiteful spirit, a vengeful ancestor, or the particular flavour of cosmic grudge that only an ancient god could cook up. If your luck has really soured, you might have caught the attention of a wandering AKH, a restless soul who, for reasons best left unsaid, has decided to poke you in the kidneys for a week straight. This is where Heka comes in, not a stage magician with a rabbit, but the very essence of magic itself, handed down by the gods. Heka is as real to these people as the Nile flood, as necessary as bread and beer, and far more reliable than your cousin's home remedies. A healer in Egypt doesn't just mutter words over your wounds. He invokes cosmic forces, channels the power of the gods, and, if he's feeling especially poetic, might recite charms like, "O Isis, great enchantress, I summon you." Cool the blaze in this flesh as you cooled the fire that threatened your own child. Horus. There's something undeniably powerful in hearing those words echo through a darkened room, sweet-smelling smoke curling upwards as you clutch a lucky amulet. Speaking of amulets, let's talk about ancient Egyptian bling, because no trip to the afterlife or to the doctor's office is complete without some serious accessories. The Eye of Horus dangles from countless necks, offering protection against everything from migraines to malevolent sorcerers. Ankhs, scarab beetles, and even tiny carved frogs are tucked into linen wrappings, pinned to tunics, or sewn directly into the bandages covering a nasty wound. These charms aren't just for show. Each one carries a specific power. The scarab to ensure rebirth, the eye to ward off evil, the ankh to guarantee life. It's a little like wearing a medical alert bracelet, but with more style and the added benefit of scaring away the occasional demon. Egyptian medicine is never just about the body. Every ache, every swelling, every suspicious rash is a conversation between you, your ancestors, your gods, and your doctor. If you're suffering from a mysterious illness, the local priest-physician might recite a prayer to Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of both plague and healing. She's terrifying, but she's also your best bet when you need divine intervention. If you're about to undergo surgery, a quick invocation to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, is standard procedure. After all, you want steady hands and a little extra brain power when someone's about to poke around your insides with a copper knife. So, as you can see, magic isn't a last resort here. It's woven into every diagnosis, every ointment, every whispered word of reassurance. Curing disease is about more than just banishing pain. It's about restoring the delicate balance between body, soul, and the entire spinning cosmos. The Egyptians are nothing if not ambitious. Now let's take a sharp turn, past the perfumed gardens and the bustling markets, and slip quietly into the chamber of final rest. Here, medicine and magic merge in their grandest performance, mummification. Forget everything you know about gloomy crypts and cobwebs. This is an operation, a ritual, and a spiritual art form all rolled into one. For the Egyptians, death is not the grand finale, but the dress rehearsal for eternity. To travel safely into the next world, your body has to be preserved with a level of care that would make even the most fastidious modern surgeon nod in respect. The body is the anchor for the car, the vital spark, and the bar, the ever-wandering soul. Both need a place to return to after their nightly adventures in the afterlife, and heaven help you if they come back to find you in a sorry state. The process starts quickly, often within hours of death. The embalmers, part scientists, part priests, part mortuary artists, begin by washing the body with palm wine and water from the Nile itself, a symbolic gesture that cleanses both body and spirit. Then comes the surgical portion, and let's just say, if you're squeamish, you might want to avert your eyes. Using a sharpened blade, the embalmers make an incision on the left side and carefully remove the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver. Each organ is placed in its own canopic jar, lovingly watched over by one of Horus's 4 sons, sort of like a supernatural security team for your insides. The brain, curiously, is not considered worth saving. Instead, it's removed in a process that can only be described as both ingenious and slightly horrifying. A slender metal hook is inserted through the nostrils, swirled about with just enough finesse to liquefy the brain, and then drawn out in messy handfuls. Not exactly the stuff of greeting cards, but remarkably effective. The heart, on the other hand, is almost always left in place. The Egyptians see it as the seat of intelligence, emotion and conscience, a sort of ancient Fitbit tracking your moral health. In later periods, if the heart is removed, it's replaced with a heart-shaped amulet, just to be on the safe side. With the organs out, the body is packed with aromatic resins, myrrh and linen, then buried in a mountain of natron, a naturally occurring salt that dries it out thoroughly over the course of 40 days. When the time is up, the now leathery, preserved body is washed again and massaged with fragrant oils. Mummification is all about layers. Hundreds of yards of linen are wrapped tightly around the limbs and torso, with amulets and charms inserted between folds like secret treasures. Each layer is sealed with a prayer or spell, often drawn from the Book of the Dead, which serves as both a travel guide and a cosmic cheat sheet for navigating the perils of the underworld. As the embalmers work, one of them often dons the mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, lending an official air to the proceedings and ensuring that the ceremony is protected from any wandering spirits or envious neighbours. In a world without antibiotics or embalming fluid, This is the pinnacle of medical technology, chemistry, anatomy, and spiritual engineering, all rolled into one. It's not about saving the living, it's about preserving the possibility of life forever. Each body is a sacred project, a bridge between worlds. Every carefully wrapped limb, every meticulously placed amulet, is a vote of confidence in the possibility of eternity. And who among us, faced with the uncertainty of the afterlife, wouldn't want every cosmic advantage available? But the magic of Egyptian medicine doesn't end at the threshold of the tomb. Venture into the cool, papyrus-lined libraries of the temple complexes, and you'll find the real treasure, an archive of medical knowledge as rigorous as anything at a modern teaching hospital. Egyptian medicine isn't just a collection of folk remedies whispered in dark corners. It's a disciplined professional craft meticulously recorded in scrolls that could stretch the length of a small city block. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, is a prime example. Over 100 feet long and packed with more than 700 remedies, it covers everything from toothaches and stomach complaints to mental disturbances and mysterious growths. Each entry combines practical advice with a dose of the divine. A treatment for a migraine might be paired with a prayer, and a salve for a sore foot could come with a warning to avoid offending the household gods. For those who prefer a more hands-on approach, the Edwin Smith Papyrus reads like the field notes of a battle-weary surgeon. It's all about traumatic injuries, fractured skulls, broken limbs, and deep wounds. The prescriptions are surprisingly clinical. Examine the wound. If the patient can speak, there is hope. If not, prepare for mourning. It's medicine stripped of frills and as close to modern triage as you'll find in the ancient world. The Kahun Papyrus, meanwhile, focuses on women's health, gynecology, and fertility. Here we get a peek at pregnancy tests involving barley grains, contraceptive concoctions, and even advice on how to deal with an uncooperative uterus. These scrolls aren't hidden away for a select few. Aspiring physicians study them at the Per Ankh, the House of Life, where they copy text by hand and memorize both recipes and rituals. Medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and religious law all get equal billing in the curriculum. Egyptian doctors are more than mere healers. They are guardians of knowledge, scribes of the gods, and, occasionally, amateur therapists. Thoth, the deity of wisdom and writing, is their patron, guiding quill and scalpel alike. Every scroll is a living testament to generations of observation, trial, error, and, inevitably, a little divine intervention. Now, if you're thinking that Egyptian medical wisdom died out with the last pharaoh, think again. Their influence seeps into Greek and Roman medicine, with big names like Hippocrates and Galen borrowing freely from Egyptian scrolls and giving credit where credit is due. Pattern interrupt time. While the Greeks get a lot of press for inventing clinical medicine, they were often just remixing Egyptian hits with a Mediterranean twist. The Egyptians' insistence on recording symptoms, tracking outcomes, and maintaining hygiene was revolutionary in an age when most people relied on superstition and a good luck charm. They developed early forms of diagnosis, prognosis, and even public health long before those words existed. Daily washing, antiseptic ointments made from honey and natron, and an almost obsessive concern with bowel regularity all hint at a society that understood the basics of preventive care before most of their neighbours had figured out how not to poison themselves. Their grasp of the mind-body connection was also ahead of its time. The ancient Egyptians didn't have brain scans, but they saw that stress, sorrow, or spiritual affliction could show up as headaches, stomach pain, or a mysterious inability to get out of bed. What they called a curse or a demonic attack, we might now call anxiety, depression, or psychosomatic illness. Their treatments, herbs, rituals, and a strong dose of community support sound suspiciously like the holistic medicine of today. Even their herbal remedies have stood the test of time. Garlic, castor oil, aloe vera, and willow bark are all still used, sometimes in the same forms, sometimes rebranded as all-natural supplements at your local pharmacy. Sure, we've left crocodile dung behind, but their early experiments with birth control paved the way for the entire field of reproductive medicine. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the Egyptian vision of the healer. A doctor isn't just a fixer of bodies, but a comforter of souls, a technician, a guide, and at times a therapist with a particularly impressive hat. Healing here is more than the sum of its parts. It's about being seen, heard, and cared for in all your awkward mortal glory. That philosophy, equal parts science, empathy, and a dash of the mystical, echoes in modern hospitals, hospices, and therapy offices. So, as we leave the cool shade of the temples and step back into the sunlight, remember this. The Egyptians taught us that people don't just want to be cured, they want to be understood. Their doctors, with their spells, their scrolls, and their endless patience, saw the whole person in front of them. Their medicine wasn't perfect. Sometimes it was downright peculiar, but it was bold, curious, structured, and profoundly human. And in every amulet, every carefully copied spell, and every mummified body, they left a legacy that still pulses in the heart of medicine today. It turns out, whether you're facing a fever, a fractured leg, or the mysteries of the afterlife, it helps to have a little magic on your side, and a doctor who knows just how to use it.